So I want to get deeper now into Eliot's four quartets, and in doing so, bring about an understanding of Eliot himself as the refinement of the poetic body, which is the aperture of the dwelling. And we are jumping off here, as we were and have been from Heidegger's late explorations, not only of Hölderlin, but of Trakl. And understanding one of the primary quotes which obsesses Heidegger of Hölderlin's, that man dwells poetically upon the earth. And this is why Heidegger asks of Hölderlin when he does and as he does in 1936 into 1937. The poet's disclosure is a lived, felt, experienced, and attended proximity to being. This could be considered to be the hearth of poesy. And we're going to get into here, again, how Eliot himself is the practice of this relationship to being, and to suggest that this poetic endeavor is itself a practice, and a practicing and a practiced relationship to being through this action and engagement of languaging and thinking through languaging. And especially thinking through languaging in its most fundamental, to return to Heraclitus, as a poetic innocence that is toward being absolutely, which is the unity of the philosophical and the poetic question, absolutely, which is fundamentally existential, which is what is being and what am I being. So this comes about, and this is legible in the particular authenticity and vulnerability of Eliot's four quartets. And so what do I mean by authenticity and vulnerability? I mean transparency of thought, the bare expression of the possibilities in the human condition by way of a linguistic leveling and a flattening, which is for Eliot in the four quartets the 0 point or the negation, the destitution descending into perpetual solitude, world not world, to leave the twittering world. And yet notably, Eliot takes the symbolic language of the twittering world, which to him has become flesh and blood appendage, which is the act of poetry which he has pursued for 20 years, of trial, error, failure, and error, which has a deep element of Beckett in it, surprisingly enough, that these works come about in very similar scopes of time in this era of World War II transformation and rubble. That what is being stripped away is not the practice of the poetic artist, but rather all that stands between the practice of the poetic artist and disclosure, which is to say that Eliot, in the poem as he was in life, is destroyed and wasted by time. And being laid to waste by time reveals what is beneath. Time within time, time out of time. Love is most nearly itself when here and now cease to matter. And this embodied wisdom of the desolation which is wrought in Eliot's life and time, as it is in Beckett's, is what reveals the richness and the riches of the authenticity of this disclosure, which is Eliot laying down the arms of the poetic method utterly toward being, which is itself a surrender of the gift that has been cultivated, again, this 20 years of failure and attempt in languaging, which Eliot explicitly states, and this is a moment of self-consciousness which is rarely seen in the poetic craft, because it is a moment of admission that every attempt is a wholly new start and a different kind of failure, which is almost ad verbatim a repetition of Beckett, or a primary and pre-elucidation of what Beckett will come to say. Each venture is a new beginning, a raid on the inarticulate. And this broken openness is well discussed by Edward Said in his text Late Style, which is, and we could describe four quartets patently as Eliot's end-of-life compositional movement. Which Said approaches frequently in a musical direction, particularly with Mozart and Beethoven, which is the cultivation, which, to use the metaphor in Eliot's four quartets, the cultivation of this garden of poesy, which is the linguistic possibilities, the refinement of the symbolic method, the refinement of this way of poetic thinking, which is the leveling of the grounds of thought across scales, time and space, history and philosophy. These forms of knowledge that have been cultivated obsessively, again, in the terms of the pursuit in the Renaissance mind, which I've previously stated, obsessively by T.S. Eliot throughout his poetic career. And that his orientation towards poetry is first and foremost, being a true poet is toward being itself, which is a deeply, as Eliot describes it, spiritual practice, and this language is moved through Eliot's practice via the Christianity of his time. And this is a movement for him simultaneously towards God and towards the point, the still point of the turning world, which is God or being. Neither from nor towards, at the still point there the dance is, but neither a rest nor movement. Do not call it fixity, where past and future are gathered. And the possibility of this late style, to work with Said a little bit here, is that there is a deep fermentation which comes to bear in this political and historical moment of Eliot's time. These pamphlets themselves of the four quartets being distributed at the beginning of the 1940s. Deep into Eliot's poetic career and deep into Eliot's life, wherein, perhaps to use a term, Eliot gives up the ghost of his poetry. That the poetry itself is broken open to its first service. That this refinement of the poetic being is that Eliot, in a way that is kind of atmospheric to Trakl, comes to the garden of death and lays to bear these powers. And these powers are a way of seeing. They're a way of being in time and a way of attention. And that when we read the four quartets, what we are reading is Eliot's attention to being in time. This cultivated attention of being. And this is embodied. This is a way of seeing, a way of looking, and then furthermore, the capacity which Eliot has cultivated to express, make legible this ontological confrontation or revelation, which Eliot is having through time, through history, and through the experience of being human, which is the path of navigating the charnel house of history, so to speak. Houses rise and fall, crumble, and are extended, and my beginning is my end in succession. This is realization being inscribed into the poetic form. And to return again to Heidegger and Hölderlin, this disclosure is what is essential. It is the riches and the wealth of life, but it is simultaneously something that cannot be owned or obtained. And again, the innocent act of poetry is a way of being, a dwelling poetically upon the earth, and it is not, in Heidegger's terms, a virtue, a technocratic or industrial virtue of obtainingness or movement or action. And this is something that Eliot understands extremely well in the four quartets when he speaks about the still point of the turning world and descending into the darkness, which is not the twittering of the world. When Eliot's provocations and invocations in that open field, if you do not come too close on a summer midnight, you can hear the music of of the weak pipe and the little drum and see them dancing around the bonfire. This is Eliot gesturing into and towards the time within time, this timeless state of revelation or realization. What is the late November doing with the disturbance of the spring and the creatures of the summer heat and the snowdrops writhing under feet? He is asking the question, and he is evoking the answer. What is time doing? What is within time that is gleaming, in Herderland's terms? What is being? And to reveal or revelate being is itself dwelling poetically in time, which is available at all times, particularly through the cultivation of experience as in dwelling poetically. And this is a practice, and this is why writing poetry is a practice. And this is why Heidegger asks the critical question, what are poets for in the midst of the world's midnight? Because the world's midnight is eternal at the deepest level. It is an eternal midnight of a perceptual failure of being. That time itself is the perceived overgrowth of forms, and that these forms themselves appear impenetrable to the human nervous system and the human developmental stage, and that poetry itself is the deploying of the perpetual relationship between the refinement of experience and the iteration of the symbolic method to break into time and to experience the eternal through time. To thus incorporate time and incorporate the human experience into the wisdom. Only the knowledge of dead secrets. The knowledge imposes a pattern and falsifies, so every pattern is new in every moment. We are only undeceived of that which deceiving could no longer harm. In the middle, not only in the middle of the way, but all the way, in a dark wood, a blatant allusion to Dante, in a bramble on the edge of a grimpen, where there is no secure foothold and menaced by monsters, fancy lights, risking enchantment. And this enchantment aspect is critical. The houses are all gone under the hill. The dancers are all gone under the hill. What this is an enchantment of is the vacancy and the void brought about by the ontological loss, the loss of the ground, which again Heidegger calls the Abgrund, or the void, the abyss, that is pulled out from beneath knowing. Valuation of all we have been, and every moment is new and shocking. This is a return to dwelling poetically, which for Eliot is deeply entwined with a relationship to God, or a relationship to being. The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. This is the state of being of the poet, which is the dangerous proximity to disclosure, which is actual intimate relationship or enfolding within relationship. And there's a fantastic allusion, and I won't even be able to place it now, but it's a statue, or I believe it's a statue of Christ that has been reabsorbed into a tree. This is a deeply symbolic and signifying image for our project, because the movement of Christ, which Eliot is describing, the relationship to being is deeply sacramental. The dripping flesh, or the dripping blood, our only drink, the bloody flesh, our only food. In spite of which we like to think, we call this Sunday good, substantial flesh and blood, that we are sound. That Eliot is with the human experience, right? This is not a disavowal of being in time. This is a deepening of being in time. Never does Eliot leave history. Never does Eliot leave the Statesman, the Stock Exchange Gazette, the Sun and the Moon. That this deepening of being in time is the incorporation of the appearance of the timely, the appearance of the human experience into the moment of revelation in the hedgerow or the rose garden. Where is the summer, the unimaginable zero summer? If you came this way, taking the route you would be likely to take from the place you would be likely to come from. Every single moment in the four quartets is a path in. A path in. A path in. Every single historical moment, every single object relationship is a path in to relationship to being. This is the gift. This is the treasure. This is the wealth of poetry, which Heidegger identifies correctly and absolutely correctly at the moment of the world's midnight, which is the industrial technological turn, which has only accelerated in the 100 years after he has decried and proclaimed this abyss as a historical condition, which is accelerating, which began before Heidegger and has continued after his project. That this way of being is the gold itself, to use an alchemical term, right? This is the gold, or this is the transformation of the human being into, right, dying, blind, and quiet. These dead men more than the dying. Why should we celebrate? We cannot revive old factions. We cannot restore old policies or follow an antique drum. Whatever we inherit from the fortunate, whatever we inherit, what had they to leave us? A symbol perfected in death. What Eliot is saying is that there is a possibility, right? There is a way into being through the cultivation of this poetic relationship, through the cultivation of perception, which is dwelling poetically, the practice of poetry, which is the restoration of the ground, the ontological ground, which appears split in history via false valuations or attempts at identification, which are impositions of false difference, which are not descents into the still point, which are not descents into the darkness, where the dancers have fled and the houses have fled into the abyss or into the void, which are not these descents, which are first and foremost spiritual descents of confrontation with the ontological ground of being itself. And that the pursuit of this descent, Eliot, like Shelley, and in many ways also like Trakl, the pursuit of this descent is a symbol perfected in death. That Eliot, in the completion of the four quartets, the writing of the four quartets, and the experience of them, leaves and gives the wealth of the transformational artifact, the transformational script, which is itself why he quotes Heraclitus, why Heraclitus is explicitly and implicitly referred to be redeemed from fire by fire, consumed by either fire or fire. What we call the beginning is often the end. It is to step into this relationship via the sacrament itself of language and languaging. And so when we've talked here, and I'll swing this back around, we've talked here about authenticity and vulnerability as transparency of thought. This is Eliot's thinking through languaging as living process, living procedure, which is the aperture, which is a process of relationship in time to being. This is laid down before the poem. And this is why with Eliot, the Four Quartets is not a poem. It is an act of poetry. It is an act of the poetic mind, cultivated at this level of profound, I won't say mastery, I'll say profound engagement via the pursuit. That these arms are entirely laid down, that this advanced languaging path, this advanced 20 years of failure, has been laid down before the true soul task, which is disclosure of being. And that what Eliot gives us is the world. That Eliot gives us the whole world. The world that is unbroken from the horseshoe crab, the whale's backbone, the primrose, the dry salvages, the wounded surgeon, the directory of directors, the lavender spray, Mars. That the whole world is integrated and incorporated into the poem as itself this disclosure of fire, of being, of now and in England. If you came this way, taking any route, starting from anywhere, it would always be the same. You are here to kneel where prayer has been valid. And prayer is more than an order of words or the conscious occupation of the praying mind, or the sound of the voice praying. And what the dead had no speech for when living, they can tell you being dead. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. Here, the intersection of the timeless moment is England and nowhere, never and always. This is one of the most profound philosophical statements that is possible, but it is made possible through the poetic act. And to understand this is crucial, because this is a thinking through languaging whose only requirement is ontological communion with being. And this is why Heraclitus is our poet-philosopher of the first order. The only commandment is disclosure and communion with the ontos. And this is why Eliot's poetry, especially in the four quartets, reads as profoundly religious, profoundly spiritual. This is the preoccupation here with the saints, or the saintly path, is that the saintly path is to mistake it as moral or ethical or religious would be to confuse the function of poetry. That the poetry itself and the writing of the poetry is simultaneously a document of disclosure and the cultivation of the instrument of disclosure itself. That the actual body is the living and dwelling of being upon the earth, in form, in the nervous system, in the somatic register. And this is why I say somatic attunement, the lived constraint of being in time, the body in presence, being broken open through the wandering of this way, which is the wilderness, to say Dante. That Eliot in his time, as Dante in his, comes upon this broken openness of history, of the body, of the existence, of the condition, in that the poetic path, as Heidegger correctly elucidates, is non-negotiable. It is the only question of this cultivation, because it is the question of what is being, and therefore how is being in time even possible? How is a meaningful relationship to being even possible? Because if there is no meaningful relationship to being, there is not. And this is what Eliot laments before he's broken open in the four quartets with the wasteland and the hollow men. And for myself, the wasteland and the hollow men very barely read or encountered, as much as the four quartets itself is a poetic achievement of the first order. Because Eliot descends. He lives on the battlefield or the ground of the dead, or in the wake of the war, so to speak, in the wasteland and the hollow men. But Eliot embarks truly on the descent and avails himself of the descent, which is the profound surrender into the world of perpetual solitude. Destitution of all property, desiccation of the world of sense, evacuation of the world of fancy, inoperancy of the world of spirit. This is the one way. Time and the bell have buried the day, the black cloud carries the sun away. Eliot avails himself to death in life. Chill fingers of you be curled down on us. This is the ineluctable, profound relationship between Eliot and Trakl, is that Trakl inhabits this death and life, and it suffices to say in many ways he remains there. Eliot moves through this turning point. The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. The houses are all gone under the sea. The dancers are all gone under the hill. And the remainder of the eye is one of the most fascinating aspects of the four quartets, is that Eliot is thinking through languaging, whereas very often Trakl disappears through languaging. This is an interesting question of the presence of the one who is thinking. And Trakl This is the fascinating part of Eliot, and I'll just kind of add this on here at the end because I think this is a separate conversation, but it is related. That Eliot himself is a very cerebral poet. That thinking through languaging for Eliot is by and large a process of his great intellect, which avails him a degree of cognitive distance even as he experiences the desecration or the desiccation. That Eliot himself thinks very much so like one who is deeply, deeply educated, because he is. And with Trakl, what we have, and perhaps what is so profoundly dark and disturbing about Trakl's poetry, is that it is nearly entirely embodied. That the population of the symbolic mode and the register is Trakl's experience of the descent into destitution, desecration. That Trakl is not contemplating this process. Trakl is experiencing it as in a total submergence. He is submerged in this descent into the abyss, or this descent into hell. And we understand that Trakl dies quite young, whereas Eliot's poetic pursuit continues and commences for decades. And this, to me, is the primary difference, that what we get and what we have lost, which is a profound loss, is the full fulmigation of Trakl's poetic pursuit through maturity. Whereas the four quartets themselves would not have been possible without this steepening and deepening of 20 years of failed attempts of thinking through languaging, toward which Eliot lays all to bear, lays his burden down, so to speak, in the four quartets, laying the burden down as in a total surrender toward the ontological project, which is the loss of the poem. That the poem itself is matterless or meaningless, but rather it is that which is stripped off. It is the clothes which remain as Eliot steps into the kind of sparkling, gleaming river of being. Look at the Platonic river of time. That is, the time is the moving image of eternity. And this is what is pierced by Eliot, and this is why the four quartets themselves are an immortal document, truly immortal document. Even if and as language dies and the symbolic order is totally rent down to the genome, that it is a document of what is possible in being human, which is not only that disclosure itself can be transmitted via advanced, highly articulate symbolic register, which is cultivated over decades and decades, a lifetime, which is the gift, a lifetime of the genius of Eliot, the Renaissance mind of Eliot, brought to bear in the four quartets, which is a transformation of the experience of being in time. Not only that this document of disclosure is possible and attendable, and that it is attended, but that Eliot himself is that which is being communicated here. That he is the dwelling poetically, which has been refined unto the breaking open, which is the true register, which is the laying down, the concerns of thinking to be any which way, or languaging to be any which way. And that languaging is at once in this maturation, this profound spiritual and existential maturation, that this entire process of the ordinance and ordinancy of the symbolic register is laid to bear absolutely in this great masterwork. And that it is itself a document of the richness of Eliot's thinking through languaging, which is itself a document of the spirit, which is the way of being of Eliot in time, which is made possible by his pursuit and the allowance to be broken open toward the innocent project and process of poetry, and to dwell authentically. in being, in time. So thank you.